All countries practice the black arts. They have spies, they have agents, they carry on all sorts of nefarious activities. There are aspects of what Israel does in its practice of the black arts, which place it in my opinion, a separate category.
South Africa did take Israel to the ICJ. You've also been investigating the judge, Julia Sebatunde, and it's come to fore recently now, her plagiarism. But you also believe that there's evidence that she's been blackmailed by Israel and everything else.
Not blackmail, I think probably bribed.
Okay, bribed. Apologies for that. Please do speak to what your findings are. But just before that, just a prelude to the answer to that, amidst everything that's gone on and what Israel's been able to get away with, and the realities that the American administration and to be honest with you, most powerful nations have allowed Israel to get away with, does the ruling even matter? Does law and what the precedence of law, does it actually even matter anymore?
Let's get to the nitty-gritty of what's been happening, and then we'll get to, does it even make a difference?
Okay.
So, again, we have to take a trip down memory lane. All countries practice the black arts. They have spies, they have agents, they carry on all sorts of nefarious activities. However, and here I have to be cautious because there are people who are more knowledgeable than myself, there are aspects of what Israel does in its practice of the black arts which place it in my opinion, a separate category. And let me give you some illustrations. So, you will recall from our conversation a few moments ago, I said that Operation Cast Lead, even though now in retrospect seems like small change, at the time it evoked a huge international reaction. There were demonstrations in the millions in London. Yes, it was huge. At least 600,000 or 800,000, but I think it went into 1 million, but I could be wrong. Memory is not perfect. So, as a result of Operation Protective Edge, the United Nations commissioned a report, an investigation, what's called a Commission of Inquiry. And unprecedentedly, they chose as the head of the Commission of Inquiry a South African Jewish individual who was active in Jewish causes and his self-description, a Zionist. His name was Richard Goldstone. And Goldstone went on a mission with 3 others, and he produced a devastating report on what Israel had done in Gaza. Utterly devastating. He didn't just limit himself to Gaza, he also talked about the West Bank and other things. And for Israel, this was a catastrophe because they couldn't use the usual epithets: self-hating Jew, Holocaust denier, and all the rest. It didn't stick with Richard Goldstone. He was a highly respected judge, and his Jewish bona fides couldn't be topped. Well, he was compared to, of all people, the Dr. Mengele of Auschwitz. He was just the wildest things were being said about him. And he weathered the storm. But then His report came out in 2009, I think, if my memory's right. And then on April 1st, 2010, in the United States, we have what's called April Fool's Day, which is the first day in April, and it's supposedly the day of pranks, where people do all sorts of pranks. On April 1st, the headline is Richard Goldstone retracts the report. He retracted. And there was no basis for the retraction. He made some arguments, but if you go through them, there's no basis. And that left really only one possibility. John Dugard, who was the senior counsel in the South African delegation at the International Court of Justice, like Goldstone, a respected jurist from South Africa, and he knew Goldstone. And he said when Goldstone retracted the report, he said, there's no factual basis for the retraction. And then he went on to say, the secret of why Richard Goldstone retracted the report will probably go with him to his grave. And the only rational inference was that he was blackmailed by Israel. I personally don't believe it was him. His daughter lives in Israel. She became an Israeli citizen. You know, if you practice the black arts, everybody has a skeleton in their closet. Maybe this person had an affair. Maybe that person had a child out of wedlock. You can always find dirt, you know? So I'm now going to fast forward. I'm just going to, data points on the trajectory. You had in the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is different from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. You had this character named Fatou Bensouda. She was the chief prosecutor on the ICC. She was the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Now, I mentioned already earlier, in May 31st, 2010, there was this humanitarian flotilla en route to Gaza to bring humanitarian aid. Israel attacked it, killed 9 people, and the 10th died later. The 10th was in a coma and then died later. Killed 10 people and committed all sorts of outrages against the other passengers. That became a case. What Israel did became a case before the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Now, this story you can't even make up. You can't make it up. The state which brought the case, the Comoros, I'm not going to go into why it was the Comoros, not so important. The Comoros brings the case, and Bensouda, the chief prosecutor, she declares, I'm not going to investigate this case. There's no basis for it. The Comoros appeal the case. They appeal Bensouda's decision. It goes before what's called the pretrial chamber of the ICC, PTC. Not so important. It goes before, let's just say it goes before the court. The court upholds the appeal. Okay? And then they say to Bensouda, the chief prosecutor, you have to re-examine this case. She claims to re-examine it, and for a second time says, I'm not going to pursue this case. It's appealed the second time by the Comoros. It goes before the court, the pretrial chamber. The second time, the pretrial chamber says, Ms. Bensouda, you are committing too many irregularities. You are committing just too many irregularities in this case. You have to revisit it. She then, a third time, she says, I am not going to pursue this case. The Comoros appeals a third time, and you know what the court says? What Bensouda did is so filled with errors, and not only old errors, new errors. But the court says, we have no legal remedies at this point, and they closed the appeal without granting the Comoros. And an obvious question arises. Why did she do this? There was a veritable civil war in the International Criminal Court because what she was doing was so completely outrageous. Why did she do it? Why? She wasn't a Zionist. She wasn't a Christian Zionist. She wasn't a Buddhist Zionist. She wasn't a Hindu Zionist. So that can't explain it. And again, the ever honorable, the ever honest John Dugard, he steps forward and he says, and he's the only one with the integrity, I won't use the word guts because that refers to a physical quality, having the guts. No, it's a moral quality. He's the only one who has the integrity to say, you know, Fatou Bensouda was the attorney general during the Gambian dictatorship. She was from the Gambia. She was accused of being complicit in torture. And what follows? She's being blackmailed. She's being blackmailed. That's why, to the complete outrage and indignation of the inner sanctums of the ICC, I'm not talking about like the Comoros, I'm talking about divisions within the ICC. Her conduct was so outrageous, but she persisted. Why? Why? What is the explanation? It cannot be that she was simply incompetent. No, that is not a persuasive explanation. There's another character who used to be, he had the highest rank in what was called pretrial chamber 1. Just let's call it the main court, pretrial chamber in the ICC. A guy named Peter Kovacs from Hungary. Another crook. There's no other word for it. In July, I mean, these things you can't even make up. So there was a whole debate within the International Criminal Court before Karim Khan had issued his arrest warrants. There was this whole question. The ICC is a state-based system, organization. In other words, you can only be a state. You can only make a referral or a complaint. It's called a referral. You can only file a complaint if you are a state. And the question was whether the Palestinians constituted a state and were therefore eligible to file a complaint with the ICC. Okay? Because you have to be, let's say somebody in the street mugs you. I'm referring to you now.
Yes.
You can't go to the ICC and say, I want to refer the case of my mugging, because you're not a state. You have to be a state in order to file a complaint. Well, there's this guy, Peter Kovacs, who the ICC, the pretrial chamber, ruled that it was a state, at least for now it's a state. I don't want to go into the technicalities, but for now it's a state, and that the ICC has jurisdiction over the situation in Palestine. The situation in Palestine meant basically the legality of the settlements that Israel is building, the crimes committed by Israel during Protective Edge, because this was before the Gaza, the last 15 months. And Peter Kovacs, he writes a dissent. Do you know how long the dissent was? I have it sitting on my shelf. I could show you. 245 pages. Now, nobody, you don't get paid enough to write 245-page dissents. Why did he do that? A dissent is usually 6 pages, 10 pages, maybe 15 pages. 245? No, there's something else going on there. Some of the footnotes were longer than the Bible. Yes, some of the footnotes were longer than the Bible. They were longer than War and Peace. And he did that on his own volition? No. Not believable. Not credible. Not persuasive. Now we come to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. As we all know, in January 2024, the ICJ rules or finds that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. About that, there seemed to be no disagreement about what it ruled, what it decided. It was reported everywhere. ICJ finds Israel plausibly commits genocide. And the head of the ICJ was Joan Donoghue from the United States. In April, she goes on the BBC program Hard Talk, and you know what she says? Oh, there's been a misunderstanding. We never found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. You didn't find that? Everybody got it wrong? Legal specialists, legal experts, revered authorities, the most distinguished names in the international legal community, they all got it wrong? It was such a brazen, flat-out lie, so audacious that she didn't even fear the reaction of all the other members of the court. She had already stepped down. Her term of office had ended. But she didn't even fear the reaction as she pronounced this audacious, outrageous lie. And then we have the curious case, which is now in the news, of Julia Sebutindi from Uganda. And she was on the court, the vice president, during the genocide case. Okay? Now, for the sake of your listeners, just a point of clarity. The genocide case did not end on January 26th with the court's finding that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. the genocide continued, and South Africa valiantly tried to get something practically done, not just rulings, but something practically done. It went back to the court in February. It went back to the court in March. It went back to the court in May. And in January, when the original ruling was handed down, Julia Sebetinde wrote, I think it was an 8-page dissent. And then in May, that was the ruling your listeners might remember. That was the ruling where the court said Israel can't launch that military offensive in Rafah. She wrote a 28-page dissent. Again, very unusual. This investment of energy and time. Dissents just don't read like that. There are 2 or 3 pages, 5 pages, And I have studied closely the whole documentary record, to the point, I will frankly admit, because most people will agree with this point by me, to the point of insanity. There'll be agreement by everybody on that particular point. Everyone listening, friend and foe alike, to the point of insanity. And it was clear that what Julia Sebetinde was writing in her dissents was completely crazy. A simple example. South Africa was very careful in its presentation, what's called application to the court. And then the application was January, but then after January, the sources it cited. South Africa adopted a very smart strategy. I guess it was natural to them, but for me, it was very clever. Remember, the ICJ is the highest judicial body of the United Nations. It's the legal arm of the United Nations, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So what did South Africa do? Its first application was 84 pages, single-spaced, and all it did, it had 590 footnotes. Yes. And each footnote had multiple references. And they were very careful. They only cited humanitarian organizations and UN organizations for their evidence, for their proof that a genocide was going on in Gaza. So they'll cite the World Health Organization. They'll cite CARE. They'll cite Save the Children. They'll cite UNICEF. They'll cite UNESCO. These are, in general, unimpeachable sources, but they're much more unimpeachable because this is the legal arm of the UN, and South Africa is only citing UN sources. So to say that the sources are false is in effect to discredit the whole UN organization. And that was, in my opinion, it was a quite very clever strategy, because the judges, a lot of them, I don't think they wanted to vote that Israel's plausibly committing genocide, but they were in a very uncomfortable position. If they didn't vote along, they're in effect saying UNESCO, UNICEF, Save the Children, CARE, World Health Organization, they're all liars. That's not a smart move. It's not a credible move, So what does Sebetinde do? Her only response is to cite Israeli state claims. The Israelis claim this, the Israelis claim that. That's not a response. First of all, you have to show why the UN sources are wrong. You can't cite Netanyahu against who? The World Health Organization. she doesn't even make a pretense of justifying her dissents. And then there was another aspect. I can't go into everything. The chapter I wrote on her in my forthcoming book, the chapter is 59 pages. But then there's another aspect. When I read Judge Sabatindi's, her second major dissent in May, no. When I read her dissent when the ICJ declared Israel's occupation illegal, that dissent was in July 2024. That I told you that one ran to 28 pages. No. That
The
one
one in
ran,
May was 28 pages.
Excuse me?
You said earlier the one in May was 28 pages.
Yeah, I was mistaken. The one in the legal consequence, it's called the legal consequences of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied territories. That one ran to 28 pages, okay? And when I read it, it was such a bizarre dissent. I said, no. She couldn't have written this. She couldn't have even known these facts. They're so obscure. She couldn't have done that. And so I assumed she plagiarized from somewhere, or somebody plagiarized for her. And I decided, I went on my Twitter account, which for me, humble person from Brooklyn, New York, no connections, nobody likes me, a pariah. And I know nothing about web technology. 0.00000 minus 1. Nothing. So I posted on my Twitter account, I said, would anyone care to volunteer to help me track down some plagiarism? I believe there's plagiarism, but I'm not certain. And about 20 people submitted contributions. I gave them the Sabatindi dissent. And I said, look it over. And they were of uneven quality. Some, they found 2 or 3 things. Some people found 10 and 12 instances of dissent. But then this fellow named Majid Abu Amer, he weighs in. It turns out he's a young fellow from Gaza, of all places, and he currently resides in Doha. Okay? And he submits 35 double columns of plagiarism. 35 pages, double columns, juxtaposing what she says with the plagiarized material. Okay? And he's very precise. He finds 32.2% of her dissent was plagiarized. Almost entirely from these hack Israeli sources, these apologists, and I think that's a euphemism for Israel. So a third, I know I'm not allowed to say a third, I have to say almost a third, I have to be precise, 32.2% has been plagiarized. And I'm happy actually to give him credit, first of all, because of the brilliant work that he did, outshining a lot of people in the West who had first-rate abilities, capacities on the web. He, so to speak, beat them out. But also, on a note of pathos, it tells you something about all the human talent that was squandered and destroyed by Israel in Gaza. I've met so many really impressive people from Gaza. When I was at the encampment at MIT last year, which is the most respected science and engineering university in our country and probably still in the world, the MIT and Caltech, California Institute of Technology. And I met 3 young Gazans who were students there. And then when I can go through it, but you see so much talent, so much ability, so much goodness, so much decency. So I'm very happy to acknowledge the brilliant work that he did. And my conclusion, I know people say I am prone to exaggeration. I am prone to hyperbole, which is the fancy word for exaggeration. But the fact of the matter is, I began my, so to speak, professional career, which was not a professional career because I never got a job in academia. You are looking at a person who was unemployed his whole life. I never had a job. I would do what's called in the United States adjuncting, which means you get a contract for a semester, and maybe you'll get a contract the next semester, and maybe you won't. And a semester is only 14 weeks. So even if I got a contract for 2 semesters, that's just 28 weeks. And frequently I didn't get the second semester contract. I never had a job. But I had, as it were, a career. Or I prefer to call it a calling, a commitment. And in the course of my life, at a young age, when I was still a graduate student, there was this book that came out called From Time Immemorial by this person named Joan Peters, and it was a national sensation. It was about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I won't go into the details. And this young graduate student outwitted and outsmarted all the experts who said this book would transform our understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict. In fact, hold on. I keep it here. So you have blurbs that say, by leading authorities, this book is a historical event in itself, a discovery that has lain in the dark all along until the revelations by the author. And as a young man, I went through it very carefully, and I concluded it was a hoax, it was a fraud. And I was vindicated. And I can name many points along my life's journey. There was a case of Daniel Goldhagen, who had written a book on the Nazi Holocaust, which I considered I believe was complete nonsense. And I believe I also demonstrated it was complete nonsense. I wrote a book on the subject with somebody else. I'll take it off the shelf. A Nation on Trial. And with Ruth Bettina Byrne, my co-author, and it was named one of the top books of the year by the New York Times Book Review. And I had a succession of, I think, revelations which were subsequently affirmed and confirmed by the general academic public. And now it's my opinion that there is an ugly, sordid, squalid pattern that you could see with Richard Goldstone, you could see with Fatou Bensouda, you can see with Joan Donoghue, and now you can see with Judge Sebutindi, who, when Youssef Salam was the president of the ICJ, and now he was elevated to high office in Lebanon, and he was replaced as the president of the ICJ by Julia Sebutindi. So she is currently the president, and I believe she is in thrall to the state of Israel. The chapter is entitled Free Agent or Foreign Agent. I believe it's the latter. She's a foreign agent. As I said, I devoted 59 pages, single-spaced, to analyzing her dissents, and then I appended the 35 pages by Majid Abu Amer documenting the massive plagiarism. I'll just say one last thing on this subject, which is plagiarism is what you can call a form of professional misconduct. It's the cardinal sin in academia to plagiarize. But with recognizing the significance of that, I believe that the far greater issue is not the professional one, professional misconduct. She didn't properly credit her sources. The real issue is the political one. The presidency of the ICJ, which still has to hear that genocide case, because right now they've not heard it. What they heard was the request for what are called provisional measures. The request for provisional measures means, very simply, there may be a genocide going on in Gaza, and unless the court does something, it'll be too late by the time the court rules on whether it's genocide. So we're asking for provisional measures so that the people will still be around when the court hears the case. It's the equivalent in domestic law of asking a court for an order of restraint. Namely, you haven't yet been proven guilty, but we're issuing an order of restraint just in case it's too late by the time the case goes to court. Or so it's called a restraining order. I believe in the basis of the evidence that the ICJ, like the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, that they have been captured by a foreign government, the state of Israel.
So just coming back to the question, does international law matter, given what Israel has done?
Obviously, if there's no enforcement mechanism, and South Africa, it did submit, I'm actually reading it now, I'll just show it to you. Hold it up. It did submit in May of 2024 a voluminous document. The essence of the document was that the ICJ said Israel is plausibly committing genocide. We are now presenting you this document to show that they have not relented, even though the ICJ ordered them to allow in humanitarian aid, even though the ICJ ordered them not to launch the offensive in Rafah, the Israelis went ahead and did it anyway. And so they submitted this document to the Security Council and requested the Security Council to act on the findings of the International Court of Justice. And obviously, as you know, it didn't happen because the U.S. blocks it. However, even though the enforcement mechanism for the findings of the ICJ the enforcement mechanism is inoperative because of the U.S. veto, notwithstanding that, these are important weapons in the battle for public opinion. And that's our strongest weapon. Our strongest weapon, we don't have the money. We don't have the organization. We don't have the power, the raw power. But we have the possibility of reaching people, of trying to organize into a compact force public opinion. And Israel and Israelis worry about that. That's why they blackmailed Richard Goldstone. That's why they blackmailed Fatou Bensouda. That's why Peter Kovacs wrote a 245. You can't imagine how insane this is. 245-page dissent. So they are concerned. They don't like it. They don't like it, even though it's true. They don't have the they have disabled the enforcement mechanism. That's true. They have disabled it. That's correct. But public opinion, yes, they do worry about it. I was at Yale about a month ago. I was invited by the Yale Political Union to speak. Now, the mere fact that they invited me is already so over the top, that they would invite me to come speak. And you know what the topic was? What the resolution was? Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. Yes, that was the resolution. Resolved, Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. I gave the way the format at Yale is, there's a keynote speaker who gives a presentation, and then students on both sides argue the proposition. 3 students in favor of the proposition, Israel is committing genocide, 3 students against. Okay? Well, I carried the day. They did the vote at the end, and it was 2/3 in support of me and 1/3 opposed. And they're not happy about that, the Israelis. Is it the equivalent of an atomic bomb? No. But does it trouble them? Yes. It troubles them that they are becoming, and it may endure, they're becoming a pariah state. They're assuming the status that South Africa did for my generation. And the status was one of a visceral, not just a mental, a visceral reaction of disdain whenever you heard somebody was from South Africa. You didn't, you could be a young kid, I mean, serious, you just knew it was in the air after a certain point. It permeated the atmosphere. You just knew if somebody said they were from South Africa, there's something wrong. There's something wrong. There were 2 famous golfers. The most famous golfer of my generation was a fellow named Arnold Palmer. And his partner was a guy named Gary Player. And Gary Player was from South Africa. And whenever they would say that, you knew there was something wrong there. And Israel is assuming that status. It's assuming that status. I feel it in myself. I met somebody the other day I said, so where are you from? And he said, Israel. And I immediately got this sick feeling inside me. Like, no, I don't like genocidal states. Nice knowing you. So I do think, one has to be realistic about these things. You will not have any knowledge of the fact, because it's such an obscure chapter now. South Africa controlled Namibia, what was called back then Southwest Africa.
I'm South African, so I do know about this.
Oh, okay. Now, believe it or not, the case of South Africa's control of Namibia, it came before the International Court of Justice 7 times. 7 times between 1950 and 1971. Okay? Finally, South Africa was ordered to leave Namibia. Finally, by 1971, it was ordered to leave Namibia. Now, you can say skeptically, what difference did it make? But I kind of agree with John Dugard, who wrote the definitive book on that ICJ ordeal journey, those 7 cases. He said, no, it didn't end apartheid, but he said it played a role. It was one forum. We all operate in different forums. At some points, we all get together in mass demonstrations where all of us, from the doctors, lawyers, and professors to the people who make our society run on a daily basis, we all get together as a show of force, of our collective power, our compact power. But most of the time, each of us is doing his or her own thing in his or her own realm. Physicians are doing one thing, they journey to Gaza, they give testimony on what they saw and experienced in Gaza. Professors do another thing. One of the deeply moving things about the encampments was how professors, they didn't know what to do to show solidarity. So they were just sending food and more food and more food. They did their thing. We all do our thing in our own separate capacities, in our own distinct competences. And I believe that this is one realm, one area, the law, where it makes a contribution, but I will never pretend to the fact that it's the be-all and end-all.